Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our three-part webinar series on modern monetary theory. My name is Chris Catanzaro, and I am a corporate finance partner at BDO in Brisbane. MMT is a much debated economic theory, one that directly challenges the established thinking on how governments should create and spend money. However, its proponents, which are increasing in number, say new approaches are required to successfully deal with the macroeconomic problems facing the world today, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. This series is designed to bring you all sides of this increasingly important debate. Hopefully, it will also challenge any preconceived views you may already have on the topic, no matter which side of the fence you currently sit on. In that spirit, we hope you will find this series both informative and enjoyable. We would like this session to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free to submit any questions you may have. With that as the backdrop, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker in our series, Professor Bill Mitchell. Professor Mitchell holds the chair in economics and is the director of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity, an official research centre at the University of Newcastle. He is also the Docent Professor of Global Political Economy at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Professor Mitchell is one of the co-founders of modern monetary theory and is a leading advocate. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Bill Mitchell. Thanks for joining us today, Bill.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation, and hello to everybody I'm sitting in Newcastle at the moment in New South Wales, so in lockdown. So I aim to talk for 30 minutes, and that leaves a good time for questions and interaction. So when you think about where humanity is at the moment, we've got some massive challenges. We've got an immediate challenge of global pandemic. We've got the challenge of our climate response, and which will require rather significant, if not massive, changes in production and consumption patterns, and significant shift in the balance between the non-government sector and the government sector towards the government sector, in my view. At least in the transition period, there's going to have to be significant increase in state activity. And if you reflect on where we've been in the last several decades, and this is the decades I refer to as the period we abandoned our commitment to full employment. If we think about that, the promises that were held out, I think about the monetarist developments in the academy, which morphed into sort of various. In Australia, we used to call it economic rationalism. The dominant economics of the profession, and which is in terms of the manifests in the sort of policies of deregulation, privatisation, reducing the size of the state in the economy, making it harder for people to get work if they haven't got work, a punitive welfare regime for those people, rising inequality, degradation of our public infrastructure, a reduction in the quality of our education systems, a challenge to our hospital systems, our health systems. If you think about all of those things, you could give the last 3 decades a pretty dismal report card. And so as we face all of those challenges, we have to ask ourselves, is our policy narrative and our understanding of economics, is it up to the task? And the problem is that the state of the mainstream macroeconomics and our understanding of the capacities of government and the consequences of governments doing things with their currency, the mainstream approach is ill-equipped. Now, I started to become a serious researcher in the sort of second half of the 80s as I was working through my PhD. And, you know, I started to study Japan a lot. I became fascinated with Japan because in '91 it had the largest commercial property collapse in history. And it had 1/4 of negative GDP as a consequence. Now you think about the GFC, the property collapse there was nothing like, around the world, was nothing like what the Japanese endured, particularly in the main cities and particularly in Tokyo. And we had enduring economic damage, but the Japanese didn't. And the Japanese took relatively, they were the first government really to abandon what we now call a neoliberal mindset, this sound finance mindset, that you have to run fiscal surpluses as if they're good, and that if you don't, you'll get accelerating inflation, and you'll get rising interest rates, you'll get crowding out of private sector in investment decision making, and all of the things that we were told would happen if the governments ran continuous deficits like they used to. And we were also told that if we engage in microeconomic reform, our labour markets will become stronger, will become better pay. If we reduce our welfare net, that'll create opportunities for people and incentives, and all the rest of the things, the privatisation of our energy systems, our water reticulation systems, our health systems, transport systems. We were all told that this would lead to increased wealth for all of us and much better lives in material terms. Now, the reality is that everybody's waking up to the fact that that hasn't worked for a vast majority of us. We now have, labour markets that are characterised by increasing precarity, increasing casualisation slowly. A number of our younger workers who are leaving education, training and employment, they're the NEET generation, and those that stay in the labour market are increasingly working in the so-called gig economy, where if you analyse the prospects for them when in 30 years' time, they're bleak. They're on low pay. They have little chance of enjoying the superannuation that I'll eventually be able to enjoy, possibly. They have limited capacity to borrow, and remember, for most Australians, the ability to accumulate any modest wealth, and typically in your own home, is because you can borrow and pay it off while you've been working, and we're denying that opportunity to our young people. And so we've got ourselves into a real state. And even people that I work with on a daily basis in the financial markets are starting to realise that what the mainstream economists have been telling them over the years has really undermined their business model. So if you take the big investment funds, their business model is often predicated on being able to leverage off public infrastructure. And with the governments running austerity mindsets in terms of their fiscal policy, the austerity typically has played out not in recurrent spending, because that's much more difficult politically to get away with, pension cuts and things like that. It's played out in capital budgets, in public infrastructure spending. And up until only a few years ago, it's been different the last couple of years because of all the Melbourne and Sydney infrastructure developments in public transport, etc., and roadworks. But prior to that, the austerity really played out in public infrastructure, and that's a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, Germany is held out as the exemplar of fiscal responsibility in Europe, but its public infrastructure is crumbling. Some of its bridges are so dangerous that transports have to go 30 k's north to cross a different bridge of a river to get across to the west, for example. And so, you know, those business opportunities to leverage off that public infrastructure investment have been drying up. And with monetary policy being the dominant way in which we've, in our so-called inflation first mentality, we've eschewed the use of fiscal policy in favour of monetary policy as the key counter-stabilising aggregate policy tool, you know, to stabilise the economic activity and particularly fight inflation, so-called. And the driving that to its limits has meant we've got zero interest rates everywhere. In some countries, we've got negative interest rates, so there's now an implied monetary policy tax, and that spills over into the bond markets where governments around the world are borrowing, you know, long-term 10-year government bonds at negative yields. In other words, the investment climate has become so tricky that businesses are willing to, you know, investors are willing to invest 10 years out, 15 years out at negative yields, pay for the privilege, so-called. And you've got the big pension funds in Europe who are facing increasing maturity mismatch on their asset and liability side. So their asset return, their liabilities have fixed capital flows there, because contractual flows built into their business, and their asset side is not generating the returns they used to, and not in a timely and in quantum, and so they're shifting their asset structures into more and more risky portfolios to keep up with their liability side. And the consequences of that are that they're facing increased risk of insolvency. And I've done quite a bit of work for some of the pension funds in Europe to see how they can work through that problem. And the GFC started it, but the pandemic has really accelerated it. We've now realised that reliance on monetary policy, of interest rate setting, and trying to get back to surplus on fiscal side is a loser. It's a losing strategy. And the countries in the GFC that employed that strategy the most vigorously were the ones that took longer and longer to get out of the GFC. And some of the countries barely got back above where they were before the GFC, when the pandemic hit. And so what pragmatics and the urgency of politics has really started to shift the macroeconomic paradigm to a situation of fiscal dominance. And of course, towards fiscal dominance and with a complementary monetary policy strategy, the so-called non-standard monetary policy. And that has increasingly around the world manifested in the form of so-called QE programs, that effectively the central banks buying government debt in the secondary bond markets, driving up the price of the demand for that debt, and driving the yield down because of the inverse relationship between the two in a fixed income asset. And effectively, we've now reached a situation, even in conservative Australia, where central banks are, which are part of government, of course, are funding the fiscal side of government. and there's all these smoke screens erected to make, they keep saying they're not doing that, but of course that's exactly what they're doing. And, you know, the European Central Bank, for example, I do a lot of work in Europe. The European Central Bank has been basically saving the euro system, because otherwise some of the larger governments like Italy would have become insolvent if the central bank hadn't bought its debt. Given that the 19 member states in the Eurozone face credit risk that the Australian government doesn't. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And so if we think about the mainstream approach to all of this, it's totally ill-equipped to deal with this reality. And we're starting to all realise, in a visceral sense, people are realising it, that the promises haven't been fulfilled, but in an intellectual sense, others are starting to realise that mainstream economics that's taught in our universities, that then infiltrates policy spaces in treasuries and central banks and elsewhere, is really a fictional world. It's a body of work that I call fictional knowledge. It's non-knowledge, because if you go back to Japan, for years and years in the 90s, the doyens of mainstream economics were predicting that the Japanese would, because the central bank was starting to buy a lot of the government debt, and since 2012, the Bank of Japan has bought 212% of government debt issued. That means it's bought all the government debt that's been issued since 2012, plus stacks that had been issued that were still outstanding on longer maturities before that. And the mainstream of my profession, the Nobel Prize winners, the professors, and the ones that get all the platforms in the mainstream media, have been saying Japan would have accelerating inflation, and they applied their theories, quantity theory of money and money multipliers, etc., to predict accelerating inflation, rising interest rates, and this is this loanable funds theory that gets taught to students, that if the governments are going into bond markets to borrow, there's less savings available for business firms to borrow in through the banking system, and therefore the interest rates rise and the business investors get squeezed out because the government is squeezing them out. And they predicted rising yields on bond markets because the bond investors would perceive that these large deficits, and remember Japan's been running deficits at least above 10% often since the 90s, 10% of GDP, very large relatively in historical terms. And you know, these mainstream economists were saying that the bond markets would eventually realise that, you know, Japan's got the largest gross public debt ratio, up to around 250%. You know, Australia's around 30 or something at the moment. So the prediction was that the bond markets would get increasingly scared off buying any government debt in Japan in the bond markets, and that they would eventually send the Japanese government insolvent and the Japanese government would run out of money. Now that's their direct predictions from what's taught in mainstream programs. Now, if you know your history, none of that's happened. Japan's had zero interest rates for 25 years. It has large deficits, large public debt. Yields are very low and negative on some of the longer term assets, government assets. And the bid to cover ratios in the auctions every month are sometimes up to 5, 3, 5, 4. They're queuing up to buy the debt that my profession has said that they would eventually stop buying. So you've got to ask the question, if a body of work has such an appalling record of prediction, there's something wrong. And in normal science, that's the trigger to shift paradigms. And I think the paradigm is starting to shift, and that's where modern monetary theory comes in. So what is it? Well, you know, my work on Japan in the 90s attracted the attention of a very large Wall Street bond player, fixed income trader, Warren Mosler, and he made contact with me in around 1994, and we got together, and he came from a non-academic banking background and me from an ivory tower academic background where I work things out logically and I do research, and he comes from a background where he does big trades. I believe he holds the largest US dollar yen trade in history, so he's not a small player. And we got together, and modern monetary theory, we started to develop, put our ideas together and start to put it into a body of work. So what is it? There's a lot of misperceptions. The first misperception is that people say, oh, won't it be shocking if we ever have MMT? Or alternatively, won't it be great? And both views are completely wrong. Modern monetary theory isn't a regime that you shift to. It's a lens that allows us to perceive the actual operations of the monetary system, to understand better what the capacities of the currency issuing government is, like Australia, Japan, US, UK, most governments are currency issuing governments. What capacities do they have? And what are the consequences of them taking different policy choices based upon that currency issuing capacity? Now, there are no real MMT policies. So people say, oh, MMT policies, they don't know what they're talking about. The MMT is a lens, and to translate that understanding of the monetary system into policy space, you need to apply a system of values. So if you're progressive leaning, you will have, and you understand the way the monetary system works, you'll want the government to be doing things like public education, public health, public transport, all of those things, full employment, reducing poverty. If you're on the right, for example, and you believe in free markets and things like that, but you still understand modern monetary theory, you have a totally different policy suite. And so what MMT does is provide a better knowledge basis for whatever the dominant value system is. MMT is neither right nor left. That's the point. Now, what it does is bring to the fore the capacities and implications of having your own currency. So we've been led to believe by mainstream economics that the government is like a household, a big household. Now, all of us today, me and all the listeners, we're households, and that means that we have a financial constraint on our spending. So I have to go to work today, as I am here, or I have to run down prior savings that I've made through foregone consumption, or I can sell something on eBay, or I can go to the bank and borrow to fund my spending because I'm financially constrained. I use the currency that the government issues. Now, the federal government in Australia, the currency issuer, has no financial constraints. It's not a household. Our understanding of household budgets provides us with zero awareness and comprehension of what the capacities of the Australian government are in respect to its savings spending choices. So not being financially constrained means that the Australian government can buy whatever it likes, whenever it likes, that if something's for sale in its own currency. And to say the government can run out of money is like saying that 3 minutes into the second half of a rugby union game, the game has to stop because the scoreboard's run out of points. That's an absurd proposition. And it's the same thing for the Australian government. It can never run out of money. And so that immediately says that if it can buy anything that's for sale in its currency, it means that, for example, it can buy all idle labour, unemployed workers, and put them to productive use. And so you start to extrapolate that logic and you say, oh gosh, mass unemployment, which is the largest aggregate income loss maker in the world, forget about microeconomic reform, that the costs of our trains running a bit slow are dwarfed by the daily GDP losses of having our productive labour resources idle. So instead of us accepting a government saying, well, we can't do anything about unemployment, the government doesn't create jobs, or we can't afford it, or if the deficit rises, will damage our children, or there'll be inflation. Well, instead of accepting all of that in the political sense, we know that mass unemployment is a political choice, because the government could always offer those jobs if it wanted to, and prior to the sort of mid-70s, it did. And that's why we had true full employment. So just to extend that then, that raises further questions, because then you say to yourself, gosh, if the government has no financial constraints, well, why does it tax us? Because we've been led to believe that we're taxpayers, which we are, but the government keeps talking about taxpayers' funds as if the government's spending them. Well, no, it's not. We pay taxes, but not to fund the spending. Because the way government spending occurs every single day is for the Department of Treasury to instruct the Department of Finance in Canberra, to instruct the Reserve Bank in Martin's Place in Sydney, to type some numbers into bank accounts on its behalf. And bang, 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 the keyboard goes, government spending enters the economy. That's it, it's funded. Now, all the monetary operations that go on out of that doesn't alter that intrinsic capacity, that if you don't have a financial constraint, you don't need to raise prior to the act of spending any revenue. So the obvious question is, well, what do taxes do? Why are they doing it? And as the other related question then is, well, why do governments issue debt? If they've got no financial constraints, why do they issue debt? And so these are the sort of questions that once you start getting into learning about MMT, you start to really probe and work out that everything we've been told by mainstream economists is actually fiction. So to just push that a bit further, here's two scenarios. The first scenario is, for example, an economy that has full employment. All the productive resources are being used. And the government gets a mandate through the next election to do a big green transition, for example, which will require it to increase the size of the government sector, at least temporarily. Now, if all the resources are currently being used elsewhere, and if the government tries to compete for those resources and bring them in from the non-government sector into the public sector, it can only do that by, it could regulate them out of existence, that's true, but it doesn't do that typically. And the way it would do it would be to compete for them at market prices, bid the price up. And because they're already in use, that will create an inflationary pressure. And so how would the government achieve its political purposes in that environment? Well, it would have to deprive the existing users of some of the capacity to use those resources. How might it do that? There's a range of ways it can do it, but taxes are a very clear way that they do use to do that. What do taxes do? Reduce our purchasing power. What does that do? It means we can't bid for as many resources as before. And what taxes do is free up the resource space for the government to spend into without creating inflationary pressures. Got nothing to do with funding the spending. Tick, tick, tick on computers, entering the banking system, that's spending. The taxation provides the fiscal space in which the government can spend by depriving us of use. Now take the second scenario where we've got mass unemployment, which we're in that situation now, and we've often been in that situation for the last 30 or 40 years. In that context, there are no constraints on government spending. There's political constraints, but there's no economic constraints. There's no financial constraints, and there's no resource constraints, because the government can go in and spend more, cut taxes, promote private sector stimulus, or direct employment and activity in the public sector, or a combination of both, and bring the idle productive resources back into productive use. National income rises, and as you reach that full capacity, then that's the point where the fiscal space starts to get smaller, and that's the time when the acceleration of government spending, or the rise in the deficit, should stop. So what a lot of people say, oh, MMT thinks it's just a party that you can just go wild and spend as much as you like. Well, you can, but that will have very bad consequences depending upon the state of the economy in terms of resource uses. So what you learn is that MMT shifts our thinking from believing that governments are financially constrained to understanding that they're not, that they're actually real resource constrained. And it's the real resource availability that should be built into all of our fiscal policy analysis, not the size of the deficit. Is a 10% of GDP deficit may be appropriate in some cases, depending upon the state of non-government spending and saving. A 3% deficit might be appropriate, or a 2% surplus. So, for example, for Norway, it has very strong external sector, bringing in demand to the domestic economy through its North Sea resources. Well, the Norwegian government can run a surplus, a small surplus, and still allow the private sector to enjoy strong public infrastructure, good public services, and strong employment because of that external revenue coming in. In the Australian case, we've typically run external deficits. And so the only way the government can run a surplus is by forcing the private sector into increasing debt. Now think about the Costello surpluses, 11 out of 12 years. Well, they were only accomplished because the household debt ratio went from 65% to 180%. Unsustainable. So the last couple of points I'd make before I hand over to questions is, well, what about inflation? Doesn't spending all this money create inflation? Well, if it did, inevitably, automatically, like the mainstream economic programs tell their students it will, well, then Japan should have had hyperinflation years ago. And the reality is that as long as spending is tailored to keep pace with the growth in productive infrastructure, there's unlikely to be any inflation coming from that source. Now, we've got some inflationary pressures at the moment, but they're supply side mostly, almost all of them. And people say, well, what about Zimbabwe? Well, I often say, well, what do you know about Zimbabwe? When audiences ask me about Zimbabwe, they say, oh, they had hyperinflation. And I say, what else do you know? Oh, they had big deficits and the Zimbabwean central bank was funding them. I said, what else do you know? And they look at me blank. They don't know very much at all. And the Zimbabwean case demonstrates that the major hyperinflations in history have been supply side events, not demand side events. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe wanted to award the freedom fighters who'd freed the country from the white colonial rule. And these military men were awarded by them being given the white farms as a reward. And it was also to reduce the land inequality. Now, the problem is that these freedom fighters weren't farmers, and the white farming sector was the food bowl of Asia. And within about 2 quarters, the Zimbabwe's agricultural output had collapsed by about 60 to 70%. And that had implications then for foreign exchange helping manufacturing, because the foreign exchange had to be used for food imports because their food production had collapsed, and the manufacturing sector then fell. Now, even if the Zimbabwean government had been running fiscal surpluses then, they would have had hyperinflation given the supply contraction. So it teaches us nothing about a government running continuous fiscal deficits tailored to the non-government saving desires. So I think I'll leave it there. I could go on for hours, of course, because there's a lot more, but I've tried to just give you a flavour, touch on a few of the controversial points to trigger some reaction, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, Bill. Thank you for that overview. We've had a few questions come through. So the first one was, savings are hitting records. Are we going to see negative rates sooner than anticipated? And what are the pros and cons on negative rates?
Are we talking interest rates or bond yields?
I think it's just interest rates.
Well, you know, negative interest rates are an attempt to the way the central banks introduce them is through interest rates on the reserve accounts that the commercial banks hold with the central bank. And the narrative is that they believe is, oh, if we have negative rates, the banks will get rid of their excess reserves through loans very quickly, and that'll stimulate the economy. Now, because the negative interest rates are a tax to the commercial banks on their reserve. Now, the problem with all of that is that it's got the causality all wrong. It's another typical example of the mainstream economists giving poor advice. Because first point to understand is that banks do not lend out their reserves. The reserves are part of the clearing system, the payment system, so that they hold reserves at the central bank so that all the cross-bank transactions each day can be reconciled and the debits and credits come through the reserve system. The banks don't lend reserves to people like me seeking a home mortgage. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that the idea of the way in which mainstream economics constructs banking is all backwards. So they tell you that the banks sit there at their desk and they wait for clients to come in to put deposits in, and then when they got deposits, they can have reserves, and then they can make loans. Well, it's totally false. The way the modern banking system works is that the banks sit there waiting for creditworthy borrowers to come in, and when they find a creditworthy borrower, they agree to create a loan, and the loan creates the deposit automatically. Now then upstairs somewhere there's a reserve management department, so the loan desk is there making all these loans, creating deposit accounts for the borrowers who then go and spend them, and that expenditure, if it's across banks, that expenditure shows up each day as cross transactions that have to be reconciled. And so the upstairs reserve manager doesn't have anything much to do with the loan desk. They've got to manage the liquidity of the bank. And so they search around looking for reserves to make sure they've got enough to satisfy the legal requirements that they've got to be in positive, they've got to have non-zero balances. And if they find that they, on any particular day, are somewhat short of reserves, they either try to borrow in the interbank market, and if other banks won't lend them reserves at appropriate prices, they'll go to the central bank and borrow them. So the idea that forcing banks to get rid of their reserves through negative interest rates was going to somehow stimulate loans is just completely false. The reason that in economic downturns that demand for loans falls is because borrowers dry up because they don't want to take on the liabilities until they know that the economy is going to start to recover again. And also the banks start to alter their perception of risk and the way they classify creditworthiness. So I don't think in Australia the Reserve Bank will allow interest rates to become negative, and I also think our fiscal policy is going to stay expansionary for long enough to avoid that as well.
Thanks, Bill. Got a question here about the American economy. And the question is, how important is the issue in America right now regarding the raising of its debt ceiling? What are the consequences if they fail?
I mean, this is, if you've been around as long as I have and studied these things as long as I have, it's like a pantomime, I can tell you. This is just the absurdity of the American political narrative. They always eventually increase the debt ceiling. They use the pretense that they won't to lobby for different things in these omnibus bills that they have, where they throw together a whole stack of different legislative initiatives. My bet is that once they've done all the horse trading, that it'll just become bang. They'll just increase the debt limit. They've got to increase it. I mean, but the point is about the debt limit. It's just a voluntary constraint. It's not an intrinsic constraint. And you know, there's a debate in America at the moment that of the $1 trillion coin, for those that have been following it. And under the constitutional arrangements between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, the Treasury Department retains the right to produce coins that are legal. And of course, the suggestion is, well, forget all the debt ceiling stupidity. Let's just mint a $1 trillion coin. And under US law, the Treasury Department could carry that coin across to the Federal Reserve Department, deposit it, and there's $1 trillion just bang like that. And so all of these things, I mean, it's just ludicrous, isn't it, that we actually take any of this seriously. The reality is that everybody in Congress knows that under their institutional arrangements, which are totally voluntary and totally unnecessary, really, the debt ceiling will rise after they've had their showdowns and their posturing, and it'll be back to business until the debt ceiling comes up in another few years. Just pantomime.
Okay, Bill, another question here about wages. And the question is, wages aren't going up. Fundamentally, do you think this is the biggest handbrake on real growth?
It's one of them. I mean, if you think about the 1980s, the wage share was 60% of GDP, and now it's close to 50%. And just first month of the pandemic, it dropped to 49%, something around there. And for various reasons, to do with changing structure of the labour market, changing industrial relations legislation, making it much harder for workers to get wage increases, declining coverage of trade unions for all other reasons, gig economy, all of that. Workers are increasingly discovering that their wage income, their wage rates, their hourly rates are static or barely moving, and the real equivalent is falling. And so what you'll get is the following dynamic, and we're seeing it already, is that, and we've been observing this for some time, that to maintain consumption growth, households typically, in the face of flat wages growth, households then started to use their credit cards. And in part, that's the reason why household debt ratios are up around 190% now, whereas in the mid-80s, they were around 65% of disposable income. And so eventually, and just before the pandemic, we started to observe it, eventually the households' balance sheets become too precarious, and they start to say, well, we can't keep maxing out the credit card because we can't pay it back, and the rising personal insolvencies add to this pressure, that they then start cutting back on consumption spending. Now, you know, if you don't believe me, believe the Reserve Bank governor, who for the last several years has been really berating state and federal governments to get rid of their wage caps. Because what's happened is that these wage caps in particularly state jurisdictions have been suppressing public sector wages growth, which then conditions private sector bargains that are going on through Fair Work Australia. And so, you know, Philip Lowe's been begging governments to get rid of those wage caps and allow wages to grow in line with productivity, which will mean that consumption spending growth's got a much more stable basis that's not relying on credit growth, which is unsustainable, and we'll get back to more buoyancy and more balance between private and public spending.
Thanks, Bill. I think we've probably got time just for one more question. Do you think interest rates rising are the solution to slowing inflation, or is it simpler to raise tax?
Well, I won't agree with either proposition. What we've learned from this 3 or 4 decades, depending which country you live in, of dominance of monetary policy is that it doesn't work very well. It's not a very effective policy tool. Now, there's growing research coming out that shows that rising interest rates, which have been held out by economists to be an effective tool to discipline inflation, the growing research evidence is starting to reveal, and modern monetary theory has been saying this since the 90s, that increasing interest rates are actually inflationary, not deflationary. Why? Because increasing interest rates push up business costs. And we don't live in perfectly competitive markets. We live in product markets where businesses have markups and some market power. And we also have oligopolistic type product markets where businesses adopt game theoretic pricing strategies to defend their market share. And so if there's one firm pushing up prices, they all push them up. And so the idea that the central bank sitting there pushing interest rates up will in some way discipline inflation is not showing up anymore in the data, and conceptually it's probably not a correct deduction. Now the other side of that is that central banks have been trying for years now, since the GFC, to get back to their so-called price stability targets. So in Australia, that's somewhere between 2 and 3% inflation rate on the all cities CPI. In Europe, it's 2%. In America, it's 2%. And of course, for years, they've been buying government bonds and expanding the asset side of their balance sheet, and through building up massive quantities of bank reserves, believing that that was going to push up the inflation rate. Why? Because my profession told them that. Not MMT economists, mainstream economists told them that. And of course, they've failed dramatically to push up inflation. Now, eventually I should tell you something, that what the mainstream model predicts that would happen must be wrong. It's been wrong for 30 years in Japan, and it's now being revealed to be very wrong everywhere. Now, so monetary policy is very ineffective. It's not a sensible policy tool to use in a discretionary way, in the way that it has been relied upon for 30 odd years. Fiscal policy is very effective. It's very direct. A dollar spent goes straight into the spending stream, creates sales demand, production response, employment response. Taxation, increase or decrease, is not as responsive, but it's still quite direct and responsive. But the problem that we encountered, the Americans encountered this a few years ago, but we encountered it last year when we had the July tax cuts. And the subsequent evaluation of whether the stimulus effects showed that there wasn't very much stimulus effect at all. Now, why? Well, the reason why is because what households did with the tax cuts was to increase their saving ratio, not their consumption spending. And why did they do that? Because they were trying to restructure their balance sheets to make them less risky. In other words, they wanted to reduce their debt exposure. And so the effectiveness of tax changes is critically dependent upon the balance sheet status of those that are getting tax cuts or tax increases. Whereas it's much better for governments to manipulate spending if they want to have a direct effect on the economy. So we'll leave it there, I think.
Okay, I think that's about all we have time for. Professor Mitchell, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, and I hope everyone had a nice time. See you later.